Wow, that was fantastic. Fantastic 1 hour of a variety of topics and conversations. So we have about 15 minutes for a panel Q&A. And to kind of get us kicked off, the first question that I have from chat is for Anna, who talked about ED census prediction. And the question was around how this model will change staffing in the ED and kind of what actions do you anticipate being taken based on this data?
Well, I think a lot of machine learning models, if they work well and if they work as intended, then their performance will be bad, right? Because they will be predicting higher volumes earlier, so something can be done about it so that the volumes wouldn't have to escalate. So that's an important point with this kind of evaluation strategies that we have upon deployment. Currently, there is a way, so I am thinking that the information can be taken into account when planning for the next day, just how much resources there can be and likely to be. They meet already and they sort of have an idea of a forecast, and now it's just a better forecast. So my sense is that it'll fit into the clinical flow quite nicely without necessarily having to introduce a whole new clinical actionability pipeline.
Cool, thank you, Anna. And sort of related to that, there's Sardar Ansari asked, a related but broader question of how do you define needed intervention? And this is for anybody on the panel who wants to chime in, although he asked this question specifically when Rishi was talking. And his challenges around, there's a fundamental issue in evaluating models that are deployed but are not in silent mode, right? So how do you really distinguish that an action that was taken was result of an alert, but not part of routine clinical care, which would have happened regardless? So how do you really evaluate the performance of model in real world when they're directly deployed without a chance for really a silent mode or some sort of control group and intervention group? Rishi, you want to take it first, and then anybody else on the panel who wants to chime in?
Yeah, thank you for that opportunity. I think one of the lessons we learned from this real world pilot was that just the mere cognizance that there is a algorithm that is spitting out information can cause change. Whether it's good or bad, I think we need professionals who are trained in that aspect to study that. For instance, with the implementation of this early warning system, there was significant increases in activity that occurred as a result of the generation of these alerts. And you can see only a small section of them actually resulted in transfers to the ICU or whatnot. But there was a significant increase in the amount of activity that was done, increased monitoring, increased orders for X-rays, and so on and so forth. So this is, I think this is a great question, and from our part, I think it's hard to know whether it is the actual model or it's some human behavior until we study it over a longer period of time. Possibly that the Hawthorne's effect, I guess, kind of kicks in until it becomes fairly familiar before people really start to see what the implementation's like.
Yeah. Anyone else wants to add to that on that particular question?
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit. I mean, I think the challenge is what is the undue effects of these models, and how much harm do we cause in them by raising alerts and false alerts? And we know that there are unintended consequences, and those are hard to measure. Where we have tried to focus is where we know that there are gaps to accepted standards of care. We know, for example, certain women are supposed to take aspirin and have barriers that those are the types of process measures that we can measure and look at outcomes from that standpoint. And we're really bringing people up to an accepted bar rather than adding on novel interventions or new tests from an alert.
Cool. Thanks,
Because
Mike.
if I was part of the prior one, but quick thing, when looking at interventions, I would say, so we have separate activities at different parts of the process. So even before we start implementing a model, one of the first things that we do is we build out customer journey maps. So we do this for a care episode, and we map out every decision that's made, who's involved in different decision points, and when diagnosis or treatment decisions are made, what are the different potential actions that users can make. So this is done more in a sit down on a whiteboard environment. And then during silent launches, I forget the way that Yin put it. Yin, you had some phrase for you actually show individual cases to people. I think that's really important. You need to watch people and how they respond to this. So sometimes we'll literally sit next to someone and watch them instance emitting. Yeah, we'll watch them dig through Epic and then annotate, just take notes on what potential clinical actions they would take based off of that. And then when you actually implement, having additional feedback loops with frontline workers involved in using the system. And then we just monitor everything. We look at all of the orders, procedures, ADTs. There's a lot of outcomes related to transfers between units, escalation of care. So a lot of these things you can monitor, and I don't know if you'll ever perfectly be able to attribute an action to the algorithm, but the proximity of the time from some notification to seeing some log of an action in Epic, like that for us is where we focus.
Yeah, and we're the same. We have process measures like that as well, and I think for us, with the favorable outcome model, I mean, we randomized, who got this alert and who didn't, and then we just watched to see what happens. There were some issues about how we implemented that, where we did some things completely incorrectly, and we can learn from that. But I think randomization it helps answer that question, right? Are you actually changing trajectory? And for sepsis and deterioration, like there's the assumption that early intervention helps change trajectory, right? And I think some of Rishi's data shows that that's probably true. So you should see an inflection change for people that get this information versus those that don't.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
I think because
yes,
just one more point. I think it really depends on the application, and in some cases you can do more than others.
Mm-hmm.
Some are really meant to automate existing processes. But for example, in ICU, one of the models that we have developed a specific app where we ask the clinician to assess the risk of the patient before they see the predicted risk, and then they're able to drag the predicted risk after they see it to wherever they think that is the right thing. So we see the change and we ask them to comment on the change. And so this gives us some estimate of how much at least the thinking process changed. Even if an action was not taken, maybe it made a person think for a while. Maybe they went and did some tests just in case, or chose to attend to a different patient, right? So this kind of things, not all of these things are currently recorded in a patient's journey in a clinic, but with the app, we were hoping to at least see what they're thinking before and afterwards and how the application affects their practice.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Changing gears a little bit, Shalmavi, you had made a. Sorry, Anthony. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just going to make a comment before we go off this topic that I think as good as data science can be, that the issue of complex phenotypic expressions of patients in the exact same situation as well as the caregivers is probably vastly underestimated, in my opinion. And this is from someone that spent most of my life in the cardiac ICU, where the two children with exactly the same situation can react very differently to the same dose of medication. So I think we're underestimating the genomic aspects of all of this. The inflammatory cascade is, I mean, if you just look at the pandemic and how people responded, it's just a very big range. And we perhaps need to think about new paradigms in addition to randomization to solve some of the enigmas in medicine, especially in the ICU setting. It's very daunting, but I think we're up for the challenge.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, if I understand what you're saying correctly, Anthony, is that like, don't discount the inherent variability in how human beings respond to some of those things, and everything cannot be measured to the level of precision that sometimes as logical data scientists or engineers or doctors we want it to be.
Yeah, I was blessed with a mentor 30 years ago, Dr. Bill Norwood, who I think some people here might know, who taught me. He had a PhD in complex math, so I was totally impressed with his level of understanding how if you look at chaos and complexity theory, it's really amazingly difficult in terms of the variation, not just with our patients, but variations in our caretakers, depending on, and I'm not talking about what level of training they're at, but they can make different decisions in the same day, given almost identical situations. So there's I have a lot of respect for complexity in human behavior, both on the caregiving side as well as on the patient side.
Yeah, that's a great point. So Shalmali, you had made a wonderful point in your presentation about that when there are some ethical challenges at the point of deployment, they may be indications of problems upstream. The question came up, like, could you give a couple of specific examples where you've encountered something like this, where you saw something at the point of deployment, but actually it was indicative of something not right happening upstream?
Yeah, so one of the things, I can give a general example. Usually I think we underestimate how well our tools work for different people. we should, if people are not aware at this point, even pulse oximeters don't necessarily work equally well for people with different skin tones. The non-stationary, I work in sequential decision making, and non-stationarity evolves with different uncertainties for different people. And I at this point we have to get that is, there's no way to manage that except to model the uncertainty and say that, okay, at this point I can't rely on my model and doing more actionable things like that. I think are better ways to address the issue. People have already pointed examples, but in our paper, we also point to things like diseases that often get ignored. Women's health issues often get ignored. And it's just a question of incentives of what problems we try to solve and why we try to solve them. So yeah, that's what I mean by upstream issues.
Yeah. Nargis, you asked that question on the chat. Any follow-up to that? Anything else that you would want to point out?
I guess that's great answer in terms of problem definition. But even once we define the problem, I was more, I guess, curious about the actual data that goes into that. For example, if we assume that we have prior records for somebody, then okay, somebody who might not have insurance, who may hop around hospitals, okay, like they would possibly be not, even the model wouldn't be applied. I was wondering if you have concrete examples in terms of the data that goes into some of the models that could possibly have very severe biases and kind of discount certain populations.
Yeah, I think people scared of reporting certain things is often the case. Missingness is not usually at random. I think that's what happens in healthcare data, especially if it's something egregious like a chronic condition they would not want their employer to see or anyone else to see. I think that's a very important issue that we end up not focusing on all that much. We just use some standard practices and find the right model with some hyperparameter tuning.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we just have a few minutes left in this Q&A session. Actually, a broader question that I would like to ask everybody who's here, and it kind of came tangentially through one of the questions. So currently, FDA does not regulate any deployed AI machine learning solutions as a device because they don't consider it to be a closed loop system. There's a human being there to actually make the decision. But there have been draft proposals out there from FDA and also from World Health Organization, kind of eventually regulating software as a medical device. So I'd love to have a little bit of conversation on, over the next 6 months, 1 year, 5 years, do you see kind of FDA thinking about regulating deployed predictive models, machine learning in clinical practice? And what would be the impact of that, and how as stakeholders, how should we respond to some of those initiatives? How should we engage with FDA on some of those initiatives? If many of you are already not engaged, probably some of you are. Anthony, would you like to get us kicked off? You're working on a lot of cutting edge initiatives in this area, and I'm absolutely certain that you have thought about it, or perhaps are even engaged with FDA currently.
Yeah, I think they're indirectly involved with them, certainly. So first of all, I'm not a fan of the term software as a device. I feel like it conjures that this is something that has a lifetime of months to years, because I think it just kind of frames it very incorrectly. But I was voted down to change that term. So I think this is a wild thought in that area. We're regulating, or trying to regulate, I should say, things that are very nimble and agile. And I wonder if, as a country or as a field, we could have a little bit of innovation how we regulate. We basically don't want bad things to happen. So I'm just drawing the analogy of Vikas to the medical profession. We don't regulate every single operation or every procedure that cardiologists and cardiac surgeons do. We make sure they have basic competency as individuals. So I wonder if, rather than always thinking about regulating software, perhaps another approach would be to think about the people that are involved in coming up with those algorithms, and if they're really capable of understanding the basic tenets and respect, the framework, the regulatory framework, rather than focusing on the algorithms. I wonder if we can focus on the humans, at least in parallel, because maybe that will alleviate some of the burden. Because FDA, I've been told, does not have the man and woman power to regulate all the algorithms that are coming their way. It's like a tsunami going at them. And I think perhaps maybe we can think about people. I'm just thinking, as a cardiologist, I do procedures all the time. There's no one regulating every single procedure. And and sometimes we have changes in the algorithm that are much more expedient than me doing one single procedure. So perhaps we can think a little bit differently, because the exponential growth of algorithms and capabilities is going to far outstretch the linear trajectory of FDA and other regulatory processes.
If I can just add, I think, Anthony, you hit the nail on the head. I think there needs to be some broad consideration of how this multidisciplinary team is involved as we go towards implementations and using machine learning for clinical decision care. Who are the people that are part of that, and what sort of liabilities should they have? Much in the same way as currently in the ICU, you have a nurse, a physician, a RT, a PT, a whole host of things. Does there need to be a ML implementer or someone there right along with them?
One quick thing too, and we're going to be kicking off some work in this space in 2022, but we need to think of regulation as an ecosystem and accountability as an ecosystem. I think too often people just point to FDA and they view them in isolation. And so in the last few months, we've started to kind of take a deep dive into different areas of accountability and structure within health systems. So antimicrobial stewardship, that's a often cited example of a different area where there's governance structures and accountability structures within a health system governing use of an innovation. That evolved over 70 years, and that is now part of Joint Commission requirements for their site visits, and it's part of CMS reimbursement. So you can imagine professional accreditation, Joint Commission, like facility-based accreditation, tying this to reimbursement policies to be eligible to receive payments. So I think there's overall been too much of an emphasis on FDA, and FDA is going to continue playing a very important role. Sorry, if I don't move, my light goes off. But we need to think about some
You
of
need
these
some
other,
AI for that stuff.
yeah, no, I know. There's no sound sensor.
You need some ambient intelligence, Mark.
It's blind. It's missing a sense.
No, I totally agree with that, Mark. I think I think it's futile to think FDA alone. And why would you want them to do it by themselves? And they can't kind of do it anyway. So I agree with you. We all need to roll up our sleeves and make a contribution in that way. And I totally agree with that.
And I think it'll happen. You know, the playbook, as you're pointing out, is being made as we speak. And as we learn new things, we realize what we need to do. And I think, you know, having researchers, especially being involved in this process, I think is really important, you know, because I think our incentives are aligned to sort of, you know, it's not a profit incentive. It's about, you know, trying to do, in a sense, the right thing, right? Trying to understand the right thing. And I think that can inform, you know, how we monitor, how we make sure these things are working. But the interesting thing, right, in all of this is, you know, a lot of this AI stuff is also falls under clinical decision support, right? And like, there's a bar that, you know, we don't apply the clinical decision support. I mean, we don't necessarily measure every time, you know, we decide to do something in the EHR a little bit differently. And so, you know, there's definitely a different level of data, you know, that's required, right? Even in the drug world, right? We talk about generalizability, you know, but we don't talk about that in the context of the clinical trial that proved that a drug worked. Does it work in other populations? We don't know, because the FDA approves it and then they go to post-market surveillance a lot of times, right? In terms of trying to see where those drugs work in other cohorts. So there's definitely a higher bar, I think, in AI and ML. You know, and it's interesting to think about why that's the case.
It's part of maybe human nature and human hubris to hold the machines more accountable than we hold ourselves accountable. So,
yes.
Yeah, that's all the kind of, you know, conversations like this, you know, getting more engaged in this community. If, for example, if FDA were listening in today, they would realize kind of how thoughtful folks are when they are thinking about putting some of these models into clinical practice, and how proactively folks are thinking about ethical considerations and whatnot. So I think conversations like today kind of give me a lot of hope and encouragement that we wouldn't get into a situation where FDA or some regulatory authority is making top-down decisions without taking into account feedback and thoughts from the community. So I think, Anthony, to your point, yeah, we need to continue to be more engaged and perhaps have conversations like this that are more dedicated to that kind of regulatory framework and what it might look like.
Because it's kudos to the FDA. They actually want us more engaged. So, because there's always a perception they're like a locked, you know, bureaucracy and no one, you know, says anything and gets in, but they actually want us really more engaged. So, and I think that's been a different stance compared to like a decade ago. So,
yeah. I know we're getting towards the end. Ian, maybe we've got a couple of minutes to wrap up. I don't see any other specific questions regarding this topic.
Yeah.
So probably we can move over to kind of wrapping up the day.
Yeah. Well, thanks everyone. You know, this has been, you know, just a really, really great session, and you know, thank you to the organizers and all the talks and the speakers for coming to talk a little bit about, you know, the work that's going on. I mean, obviously the number of stories, right, is huge and it's growing, right? And I think it's really individual efforts, right? Your participation, telling these stories to each other, which helps us just remember these tiny things that can make a huge difference when we're actually thinking about doing these things in our own institutions, right? And trying to be successful and being like, I think I remember someone saying they did it like this there, right? And I think this is the kind of exchange that we're hoping for over time. I have to figure out how we can keep the conversation going. In my head this morning, I woke up thinking, oh, podcast, that would be great. But that's, I don't necessarily have time for that kind of thing. But I would love to figure out a way for everyone to tell their stories, for us to have rotating people, who come, maybe not for 4.5 hours, but maybe for something shorter, because I think this is so valuable, for people to talk about these kind of things. So thank you so much. And yeah,
maybe we should do a SMILE Slack channel to kind of keep the conversation going offline.
I have so many channels I'm part of. Well, we're going to start with the listserv. So, we have an opt-out listserv.
That is so 2019 because
That's right. That's so 2019. So so we have a listserv. We're going to send out some meeting notes afterwards. And I think maybe from this inception of group, we have probably like 600 people on this listserv now. So maybe, we can figure out how to, I want to call these pop-up symposiums in the future where, not a lot of planning time. We could just get together, and thank you for Crystal and Ben and Tamara for helping us do all this work up front, because we think we can do this a lot quicker next time. And just continue to have these conversations, maybe every 3 months or so, partnering with ABIM and Anthony and his group, and just trying to figure out how we can, just keep the conversation going and make sure that we know each other, so that, when we need each other, we can just say, hey, I know this guy, and then, we're off to the races. So thank you. Nargis, Karandeep, Vikas, anything to add?
No, I just want to express my gratitude to all of you for coming together, and wonderful speakers and everybody who generously devoted their time and expertise and knowledge to further this community. It's amazing.
Yeah, and I'm
All right.
looking forward to continuing to see you all.
Absolutely. All right, 5:01. We're done. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for the 90 people that stayed all the way to the end.